Please go to elithecomputerguy.com in order to view schematics, code, and more for the projects that you are learning about. Welcome back. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to use UFW in order to try to help secure your Linux server. So UFW stands for Uncomplicated Firewall. And so this is the firewall software that is built in standard to Ubuntu now, and you can also install it on other distributions of Linux if you like. As with all things in the Linux world, there are a hell of a lot of firewall options out there. I'm going to show you UFW because it's quote-unquote uncomplicated. It's relatively easy to use. It's built into Ubuntu. You can run it on most distributions of Linux, and therefore it's a good default standard to show you how to use. But again, there's other firewall software out there that may be better for whatever application that you're trying to accomplish. Now, when you're talking about firewall software, again, in the security world, it's important to understand is that different types of software do different types of things in order to provide security for your server. So antivirus software that looks for things like viruses. It's important to understand all that firewall software does is it simply allows or denies access to particular networking ports on your server. So different networking protocols require different ports. So HTTP requires port 80. FTP requires port 21 or possibly 20. SSH requires port 22. So basically, by allowing or denying access to those particular ports, you either allow or deny access from the outside world to your system on those ports. Now, doing blanket blocks generally isn't the greatest policy in the world, like doing a blanket block of SSH, doing a blanket block of port 22 may not really make a lot of sense in the security, the world of security. Basically, with the idea is if you're going to do a blanket block of a service, well, then why not simply remove that service from your server? If you're going to do a blanket block of SSH for everybody in the entire world coming over through the network, then the question is, well, why don't you just disable that SSH service or simply uninstall the SSH service? Where the firewall really becomes powerful is because you can go in and you can specify things such as certain IP addresses are able to have access to certain ports, or even certain entire subnets can have access to certain ports. So let's say you need to use SSH in order to remotely administer your server. Now, you don't want to do a blanket block of SSH, because if you have to remotely administer your server and you block all IP addresses from being able to remotely administer your server, that means you'll de facto not be able to connect to the server. So that's not good. But you don't necessarily want SSH to be open to the entire world, because then people in China and Norway and Uzbekistan will try to hack into your system. So one of the things that you can do with UFW is you can say, I want my specific IP address to be able to access SSH on this server, but literally nobody else. So this may be valuable, especially in a business environment. So let's say you have a server room, you have a few Linux boxes running that server room, and you want to be able to SSH into those Linux boxes, again, just to do basic administration or take a look at basic log files. Well, what you can do is you can allow access for your specific IP address to use SSH to those Linux boxes. So that allows you to be able to remotely administer those systems even within the building. But again, people from the outside world or other IP addresses in the building literally will not be able to access the SSH ports. So these are the kinds of things you need to be thinking about when you're dealing with security and when you're dealing with firewalls. Again, is the best, most appropriate way to go about security. If you're going to blanket block a port on a server, then one of the questions you should ask yourself is, then why is that service even installed on the server in the first place? Maybe instead of worrying about the blanket block, maybe simply uninstalling that service would be the better way to go. So what I'm going to show you how to do today is I'm going to show you how to enable UFW on Ubuntu. Again, UFW comes with Ubuntu, so you don't even have to install it. I'm going to show you how to look at the status of UFW. I'm going to show you how to add rules to UFW, delete rules from UFW, and basically give you the overview of how to use this in the real world. Now, one of the quirks that I'm going to tell you, again, when we talk about uncomplicated firewall, again, when you get into the networking world, when you start layering technologies on top of each other, uncomplicated, again, becomes the eye of the beholder. Now, one of the things that I had to do in order to make the IP specific rules actually work on the virtual machine that I'm showing you, is I actually had to use a hardwired connection. So again, I use a Mac operating system. I have VirtualBox installed on that Mac operating system, and then I have Ubuntu within a virtual machine within VirtualBox. Now, something that was very interesting with this, and again, one of those weird quirks in the networking world, is if I allowed everybody in the world to have access to a certain port, when I was on my Wi-Fi connection. So basically I use Wi-Fi and I simply use a bridged adapter within VirtualBox to use Wi-Fi. So when I use my Wi-Fi networking card within my MacBook Pro, and I allowed everybody access to a certain port, 22, 21, whatever else. That worked throughout my network. My iMac Pro could connect to the virtual machine, the MacBook Pro could connect to the virtual machine, everybody could connect to the virtual machine. The weird part is that if I specified a specific IP address, so I said I only want this IP address to be able to connect to the Linux server for this particular port, and I was using the Wi-Fi network card in the MacBook Pro, that literally did not work. It failed completely. My iMac Pro could not connect to it. The MacBook Pro, the host machine itself, could not connect to the virtual machine. It did not work at all. What I found, I honestly am not sure why, but when I use a Thunderbolt wired network connection, and I start using that as the network card for that bridged adapter in the virtual machine, then all of a sudden, when I typed in the specific IP address, then that actually did work. So this is just something to realize. If you're using UFW on its own box, so you have your own physical server, you install Ubuntu onto that physical server, and then you start playing around with UFW and networking, you should have no issues at all. I will tell you, if you're doing these demonstrations, if you're doing these labs in a virtualized environment, especially once you start dealing with firewalls and specific rules in firewalls, you may have to do some additional troubleshooting to try to figure out what the hell is going on. Literally took me about 30 minutes to figure out the solution for this, to actually make the lab work. And so just realize if you're using VirtualBox or VMware Fusion or Parallels or anything like that, if you're using the bridge network connection, literally what adapter you're using from your physical computer may cause you issues with how the firewall works. So that's just one of those warnings. It's just one of the warnings. Again, once we start getting a little deeper in with these classes, just simply the fact of the matter is your particular environment, you may run into specific quirks and you may have to troubleshoot those quirks. And I can't necessarily tell you what all the answers may be because I'm sitting here talking into a camera. So anyways, with that, let's go over to the computer and we'll go into this demonstration and I'll show you how UFW works on Ubuntu. So here we are at my MacBook Pro. Again, as I've talked about before, I have VirtualBox installed. I just want to go over to the settings for a second and show you. If we click here on settings for the virtual machine, we go over to the network. We can now see that I still have the bridged adapter. So this is still the bridged adapter setting that I've been using for these last few demonstrations. But if we go down here to the name, we have Thunderbolt Ethernet versus the Wi-Fi. So again, for me to be able to do the demonstrations that I'm showing you today, I needed a hardwired network connection. If I tried to use the Wi-Fi adapter for the bridged adapter, it just failed out. And I really honestly can't tell you why. So this might be something you have to go in and troubleshoot. So if you're having issues, try to use a wired network connection under bridged adapter and see if that works for you. So with that, let's go over to the Ubuntu server. Again, running Ubuntu 18.04.3 LTS, but basically any Ubuntu that you use, this should work for you. It's worked for about 10 years and should work for 10 more. Again, if you're using CentOS or another Linux distribution, you can literally you can install UFW and then everything else that I show you should work too. So let me log in. We're going to go to Bob. We're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we are going to hit enter and we are here. So let me clear the screen. And there we go. So here we are at the standard command line. Now, one of the things that I want to do is I just want to bring up Filezilla here. So just to kind of show you from a networking standpoint, to show you how this works. So currently I can put in 10.0.1.4. That is the IP address of this Ubuntu server. I can put in the name Bob. I can put in the name password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so this is the whole FTP setup that I did in a different demonstration. I can do quick connect. It's going to ask me, it's not secure. I'm just going to say okay, because this is a lab environment. Okay, so now we can see that I was able to connect to the FTP server. No big deal, no problem. So there is no firewall at this point. I can connect. So then what we're going to do now is we're going to do sudo, so super user do, and then I just want to check the status of UFW. So we can put in UFW, and then we can ask what the status of UFW is. We then put in the password, 123456, and we can see that the status for UFW is currently inactive. So right at this point, I have no firewall running. So SSH works perfectly, FTP works perfectly, any other network service that I would put on this Ubuntu box would function. I wouldn't have to do any further configurations. But look, we're worried about security here, so let's actually enable UFW. So what we're going to do is we're going to do super user do, and then we're going to do UFW, and then it's simply enable. Again, we do not have to install UFW at all. It's already built into Ubuntu 18.04. Then we're going to hit enter, and so now firewall is active and enabled on the system. If we go back here and I do quick connect again, we can see it's trying to connect up here. And basically it is now failing out because UFW is now running. If we go and use a different username, let's say Tim123456, and again we hit quick connect, it is now trying to connect and it is failing, it is unable to connect because UFW is now running. So that's one of the first things to remember whenever you enable UFW is UFW by default denies all incoming connections. So if we use the command, so what we can do is we can do sudo UFW, and then we can do something called status and then verbose. So when we're dealing with status and UFW, there's a couple of different statuses, questions basically you can ask, commands. So if you simply just plug in status itself, it's going to tell you whether it's active or inactive. If we do status verbose, what that's going to do is it's going to give us a bunch more information about what's going on with the status of UFW. So we're going to click on this, and so we're going to see, okay, so the status is active, logging is on, just low, so it does do some logging. We're not going to worry about that today. Then default. So the default when you turn on UFW is deny all incoming. So this is very important, right? If you have a web server and you enable UFW, nobody's going to be able to get to that web server until you start allowing port 80 to actually have access to the web server. So this is one of the ways that you can screw yourself up really bad is you decide to secure your Linux box, you enable UFW, and then basically all networking services, unless you've actually allowed them, will no longer work. So if you have SSH and FTP and SMTP and HTTP, all those networking protocols, you have to go in and you actually have to specifically allow those so that people can have access from the outside world. So just remember that. By default, all incoming connections will be blocked. All outgoing connections, so this is updates, getting to the internet, that type of thing. So anything going out will work. Then there's routed, so you can actually route IP traffic through your Linux box. You can actually use your Linux box as a router. That is disabled by default, and that is not something that we're going to be worrying about today. So basically, we're sitting here, and we can see, okay, so all incoming connections are denied, so that's not really going to work for us. So we just want to allow. So let's say I want to be able to allow FTP connections. So for that, all I do is I do sudo, so super user do, UFW, and then I can simply do allow, so allow, and then 21. So sudo UFW allow port 21. I can hit enter. That rule has been added. If we go back and do sudo UFW status verbose, we can now see that deny all incoming, but for port 21, allow in from anywhere. So again, this is an important thing to think about from a security standpoint. This literally means anybody that has a network connection that can actually get to your server over the network will be able to access it on port 21. So if we come over here, again, we put in Bob again, we put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 again, we hit enter, and there we go. Now we are able to get into the FTP connection, no big deal. But let's say if we want to go over and do SSH, so let's say bring up terminal. So this is the cool thing. So I can do SSH, as I showed you before. Then I do Bob at 10.1.0.1.4. So this is the user account name that we'll be logging into with SSH. This is the IP address, and then I hit enter, and you can see basically now it's failing out. This should be instantaneous. As soon as I do SSH and I hit enter, I should be connected. It's going to fail out. The reason is because we have open port 21, so we're allowing port 21 to have access, but that's it. We have an open port 22, and port 22 is for SSH. So what we can do is we can also do something such as allow from a specific IP address. So let's go and take a look at the IP address for our particular machine here. So we can go to System Preferences, we can go to Network, and then we can see our IP address. So 10.0.1.19. So I want to allow traffic to port 22 for 10.0.1.19. So what I can do here is I can do super user do again, sudo UFW, right? And then what we're going to say is allow from 10.0.1.19. And then this is kind of weird. It's to any port 22. And this is kind of like Linux programmer wording. So basically this makes sense. So UFW allow from this IP address and then to any port 22. That's a little confusing, but you got to plug all of that in. So basically what you're saying here is allow from 10.0.1.19 to port 22. And you just got to put that any there, just so it works. Then we're going to hit enter, rule added. Again, we're going to go back to sudo UFW status verbose. And we go back, and now we take a look at the rule. And so to port 22, action allow in from 10.0.1.19. So I can go back here to my terminal. So this is on my host machine. I can get out of this. Then I can try this again. So SSH Bob at 10.0.1.4. I hit enter. See that quick? It asks me for my password. I get in, and now I'm actually in the machine, right? So that's how you both are able to allow a specific port to be open to the entire world, and that's also how you allow a port to be open to a specific IP address. And so you can put you can do multiple rules. So if you wanted multiple individual computers to be able to connect to port 22, you could simply go back here and you could simply add, whatever IP addresses you want. You hit enter. Let me just clear the screen. And then if we go back and we do sudo UFW status verbose again, we can see now port 22 allow in 10.0.1.19 and port 22 allow in 10.0.1.22. So that's how you can go, like say if you have multiple machines in your environment. Now one of the questions is well, what about just adding an entire subnet? So imagine you have something like a web server. So you have a web server that you want people in your company to have access to, but you don't want people from the outside world to have access to. So basically you can do more or less the same, the command that looks a lot the same, and allow access for an entire subnet to a particular port. So again, let's say port 22 again. So what we're going to do is we're going to say super user do sudo UFW, then we're going to say allow, and then we're going to say from. And now here we're going to give a subnet. We're going to give a network instead of a specific IP address. And so we're going to say 10.0.1.0. So again, for the whole subnet, it's going to be 0. You're not going to put a specific IP address here. Then you're going to do /, and then you're going to give whatever the subnet mask is. So if it's a class C, it's a /24. If it's a class B, it's a /16. If it's a class A, it's a /8. And if you're doing some wacky ass subnetting in your environment, it'll be a / however many octets you're using in order to create your subnet mask. And from there, you just do any port and then 22, just like we did before. So basically this is the difference between a specific IP address and a subnet mask. And so you do 10.0.1.0, that represents this entire network, add a /24 to any port 22. We hit enter, rule added, we go back, sudo FW status verbose. And we take a look, and okay, so now we can see again, port 22, these specific IP addresses are able to have access, and then for port 22, you can also do for this entire subnet, right? Now beyond that, instead of putting in a specific port, you can also use the name of the service, though you do have to know what the name of the service is. So let's say we want to allow access to FTP. So instead of saying port 21, we simply want to say FTP. So you can do sudo UFW allow, and then instead of saying a specific port, we can simply put FTP here. We can hit enter. The rule has been added. We go back and we take a look at the status again, and now we can see that port 21, so these have been added here. So that's using FTP instead of using the actual port number 21. You can use that for FTP, you can use that for SSH, you can use that for HTTP. I would argue, especially if you're new, you should figure out what port numbers, the actual numbers you need for any particular service, and plug those particular numbers in. I think that'll work better for you, but you can plug in, again, you can plug in the service name, FTP, SSH, whatever else. Now the question then becomes, how about deleting, right? So we got all of these rules in here. What about if we no longer want 10.0.1.19 to be able to have access to the server? So let me clear the screen again. And so then what we can do here is we're going to use a different status. We're going to use a different status. So sudo UFW status, and then we're going to use numbered as the option. And so what this is going to do is it's going to show us all the rules, but it's going to show us with a number beside it. So the first rule is 1, the second rule is 2, so on and so forth. So basically I'm looking at these rules and I want 10.0.1.19. I no longer want this person to have access. So what I can then do is I can use the number to delete them. So what I do is I do sudo UFW delete, and then I say space 2. So whatever number rule that is, I plug that number in here, I hit enter, deleting, you say yes, and then if we go back and we take a look at the status again, we can see that 10.0.1.19 is no longer there. So that's the basic of how this works. So you can open up a port for anybody in the world who has a network connection that can connect to your server. You can open it up for specific IP addresses. You can open it up for specific subnets. You can open it up, again, you can put in multiple rules. So you can put in specific IP addresses and a couple of subnets and do a whole bunch of other fancy things. And so that's the basic idea of how UFW works. Now for here, when I added the FTP, when I said FTP versus a specific port number, it added this TCP. So you can actually specify TCP and UDP. Those are particular protocols. I would not worry about it at this point. If you're watching this particular video, just simply allow whatever port you want to allow, and then that's something to learn about later. But that's basically the basic of it. Now at the end, let's say you go through all of this and you're like, okay, this is fun. I've been doing all this stuff, but now I have a massive list of all of these different rules. I want to get rid of them. What you can actually do is you can simply use the reset command. So if you use the reset command, that will delete all the rules and actually disable UFW. So we can do sudo UFW reset. We hit enter, you say yes, and now it's done. So we do sudo UFW, we go back to status. We can see the status is now inactive. Let me clear the screen. And then if I do sudo UFW enable at this point, it'll now enable, and I can do sudo UFW status verbose. And now we can see that all of those rules that I created during this demonstration have gone away. And so that's a basic idea of how to use UFW as a firewall on your Linux server. And it's simply a way, again, to secure things such as a SSH. SSH is an invaluable tool, but it's also a massive security hole. Again, things like FTP. FTP can be a great tool. It can be a massive security hole. So by adding those to your server, but then locking them down so that they can only work for specific IP addresses. That's a way that you can gain access to your server, you can gain functionality for your server, at the same time not compromising security to such a horrible degree. So there you go. There's a basic overview of how to use UFW on your Linux server and an idea of why firewalls are important on your Linux boxes. Again, the great thing about Linux boxes is you can create what are called headless boxes. So what headless boxes mean is you simply have your machine running. You literally don't have a keyboard, you don't have a mouse, you don't have a monitor plugged into it. It's just off sitting in a corner somewhere, and then you use something like SSH and FTP to go and actually administer it. So that's a great thing about the Linux world. But if you don't lock down SSH, FTP, whatever other protocols you're using with something like a firewall, that can be an absolutely massive vulnerability for your system. And so by using the firewall, this is a way to give yourself remote access to the system, but then also try to lock down the security a little bit so, the hackers can't come in and cause an absolute mess. Now, I will warn you with this, what I showed you with UFW, if everything is working how it's supposed to work, if your network is working how it's supposed to work, all the routing is doing what it's supposed to do, then learning UFW should be relatively simple, right? Basically, you're just using IP addresses here. You just have that basic understanding of subnet masks, and you figure out what the port numbers are. But again, this is where things can start to get very complicated if you don't have a network that's working perfectly correctly, or if you're running into some quirks. Again, in order to show you the demonstration that I showed you today, for whatever reason, I had to connect my Thunderbolt network adapter into my MacBook Pro, connect it hardwired to the physical network, and then once I did that, then the specific IP address rules would work. But I'm telling you, before I did that, when I was using my Wi-Fi as the bridged adapter for this virtual machine, again, if I opened the port completely to the entire world, if I did allow, port 22, and that's all I did, that worked fine. All my computers were able to access the virtual machine. As soon as I said allow from, whatever the IP address is, to the specific port, whenever you had that specific IP address or a specific subnet mask in there, it just simply would not work when I use the bridged adapter for my wireless card, and so it only works if I use the hardwired connection. So this is where we start getting into that world where the basic concept of what I'm showing you is simple, and you can explain it in a couple of minutes. But if you start to have any problems, if there has to be any kind of troubleshooting, that's where things can get a little bit complicated, and that's why you have to have a broader view of your technology environment. So at this point, not only do you have to understand Linux, but you also have to understand the basics of networking. Again, default gateways, DNS, IP addresses, what these things actually are, what a subnet mask is, how to find these types of things. Because in order to go any further, you will have to be able to know that information and be able to do your own troubleshooting to figure out why something isn't working. But anyways, UFW itself is pretty simple. There are other there's other firewall options out there, but this is a nice, basic, simple one that you can use, especially in the beginning when you're just trying to spin something up and play around with it. So, as always, I enjoyed doing this video, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.